Bill 1091. The clerk will read the bill.
HB 1091 by Paul, relating to practices and procedures for an early voting ballot voted by mail.
Chair recognizes Mr. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, what this bill does is first and foremost try to help create a way to increase confidence in our mail-in ballot system in the state of Texas. We've all been through elections and people are always complaining about they found extra ballots or how did the mail work, they were digging stuff underneath. You can say if it's true or not, but this is a way to help rein that in. So that's its number one function, its number one purpose and the goal of what we're trying to accomplish. It does that by two things, making sure that the mail-in ballots can't be received beyond Election Day, and by making sure that there's a process in place to try to get the count out to the citizens as fast as possible so that, again, you can have confidence. That's it. We're not having days of counting ballots by mail.
Mr. Speaker.
It also includes to make sure
Mr. Busey, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
Does the gentleman yield for questions?
In just a few seconds.
Not at this time.
It also includes an executive order by President Trump to say that we need to make sure that have a provision in state law that we do not count ballots by mail that received after Election Day. If we don't comply with that executive order, Texas will lose millions of dollars of aid that the federal government gives us to help our elections. And with that, I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Busey, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
Gentleman yields for questions.
Yes.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Paul, I just heard your layout. I want to talk about a little bit about our conversation in committee. Your stated intent in committee of this bill, you told us at the committee that it was to give voters more time. However, as we walk through your bill shortens both the application and the ballots received deadline for ballot by mail. It changes the application deadline from 11 days before Election Day to 15. So that is 4 days less than voters would have right now if we pass your bill. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, well, so if you remember right, in committee, there was a little bit of a different bill. And in committee, we were trying to say that we wanted to put a hard deadline on Friday to receive these mail-in ballots. So that gave you a couple extra days to have those ballots by mail be received in the central counting office. That's what the extra days I was referring to. But the executive order stated that, hey, we need to make sure that those mail ballots could come in on Election Day. So in order to make sure and accommodate the executive order, we changed that.
Well,
I'll get to the 15-11 day. In order, when that Friday date was there about pushing it back, we kind of slid the whole process back to match that, so it matched existing code. And that's what that was on the 15-11 days.
Well, and I'd love to talk about the executive order, and I want to get to that. But before we get there, I just want to be clear. This is 4 less days, and I'm on the committee sub, the bill that is before us on the floor, 4 less days to send an application. Isn't that correct? The current law is 15 days before election. Your committee sub will make it 11 days.
The 15th to 11th day was, as I just explained, what was going on there. You can apply to receive a ballot by mail on January 1st if your election day was November. So you have 319 days to apply for a ballot by mail.
So yes or no, this is 4 less days than current law. Is that correct?
Those four days are something different, but you got plenty of time to apply for a ballot by mail because you can do it in January. And that would mail you a ballot by mail for every election in your district all throughout that
I'm not
course of
arguing
the year.
with the start date. I'm arguing with the cutoff date. And in committee, it was presented as more time, but it is 4 less days now.
The more time,
the committee
the more
sub, is
time
that
was
correct?
dealing with the days that more ballots could come in, as you know.
Okay, well, it changes the ballots received deadline for domestic ballots from 5 p.m. the day after Election Day to now having in the committee sub before us, having to be received by the time polls close. So that is also less time for legit Texas citizens' ballots to be received. Is that correct, yes
It
or no?
does change that from having the ability to receive ballots on 5 p.m. the day after to 7 p.m. election day. That is correct, but that's in line with the executive order to make sure you do it.
Something
Citizens,
federal government is saying is what you're saying?
Well, we always have to work with the federal government, and you say that all the time.
Well,
so what?
So
but what
yes or no,
citizens
this
are going to
is
have
one,
to.
this is
Citizens are going
less
to have
time
to
for
make
ballots
sure.
to be received, is that correct?
Citizens are going to have to make sure that they're responsible to get their ballot on time. They always did. They were going to be responsible to get their ballot on time if that deadline was 5 p.m. Wednesday or if it was 7 p.m. Tuesday. Either way, they're going to have to make sure that it can get in and got time for the mail to get it there. So that
Representative
doesn't
Paul,
change.
I'm just trying to get a yes or no. Is this less time for ballot by mail to be received?
I think
Under your bill.
I think it's insignificant. The people are going to have to make sure and get their ballot in on time, and that hasn't changed.
Is,
and that's never going to change.
is insignificant your way of saying yes, that it is less time?
It's insignificant. My way of saying it's insignificant.
Okay, so is it more time for ballot by mail to be received, or is it less time for ballot by mail to be received? I just want to make
the deadline is the deadline. You just have to get your ballot in on time.
Okay, what is the current law deadline?
Current law is 5 p.m. on the day after election.
And your bill would make the
Change
deadline
it to
when?
7 p.m. on the day of election, as I said earlier.
So that is less time. I mean,
In your mind.
The reason, thank you, sir. The reason I bring it up is 8 times in your committee layout, 8 times you said this bill would increase the time for ballots, and I'm worried that because that was said in committee and people voted based on your layout, that people believed when they passed this bill out of committee that it would create more time, when in fact it absolutely does not do that. It creates less time, as you just acknowledged here. And so I'm just concerned that the 8 times in committee it was stated that this would create more time led our colleagues to be confused about what this bill does,
I don't think
which is
anybody was
why I'm making
confused.
this point now to
Yeah.
make sure that everyone here understands what it does.
I don't think anybody's confused about the bill. The fact that the executive order came in at the time after this was done, and we had to incorporate that executive order, that's what that might change.
Let me ask you about impacts of this bill. Okay, let's just talk about the substance of the bill. Can you remind the body which groups are eligible to vote by mail in Texas? Because I want to make sure everyone here understands before they take this vote which people in the state of Texas will be impacted by this
bill
change.
does not change anything in shape, form, or fashion who's eligible to vote by mail.
But it does change the timeline for people to vote by mail, and I just want to make sure everyone here understands that a support of this would be impacting the timeline of certain groups of people in the state that vote by mail. Do you know who would be impacted by shortening the time for ballot by mail?
We're not changing anything to do who's eligible to vote by mail.
Well,
We're not changing the
agree.
process of how you apply to vote for by mail.
We're also changing the timeline to return a ballot by mail. And I want to make sure
changing
we know who is going to be impacted by that shorter timeline.
Okay.
Okay, can you tell the body who will be impacted by the change in your bill for that timeline? Who votes by mail?
I didn't change anything. My bill deals with the process that I laid out in the beginning of the layout. I've not touched who can apply for ballot by mail or how they apply for ballot by mail. So
I agree with that, but it does impact those classes of people. So I'm happy to inform the body, and you can confirm with me, it's voters with disabilities, isn't that correct? That can cast a vote by mail?
I answered that question, Mr. Busey. You know that it doesn't affect. We did not change anything in this bill, and I'll try to stay on the topic of the bill and talk about what we did change. And you had comment on that, and I agree with what you're saying. What I'm saying now is just talk about what's in the bill actually, and we don't change anything of that in the bill.
Well, I agree, but what we are
Okay, let's
changing
move on.
is the return deadline for ballot by mail for a certain class of people, because not everybody in the state gets to vote by mail. So I just want to make sure everyone here, before they cast their vote, understands who is going to be impacted by the shorter deadline. That is voters with disabilities, 65 and up voters, voters who are out of the county for all of early voting and election day, voters who are incarcerated but otherwise eligible to vote, civilly committed voters, and persons within 3 weeks before or after expected childbirth. Isn't that correct, Representative? They're not touched by it. Isn't that correct, Representative, that is the
You
class
finished?
that will be impacted?
Okay, if you say so.
My concern here is, and members, I hope you heard the answer, that yes, 65 and up voters, voters with disabilities, we are saying to them, if you've cast a legally cast ballot, if you have postmarked it by 7 p.m., but it arrives now after 7 p.m. on election day, we're going to throw your ballot out.
And
we don't
Mr.
care
Busey, that's
that it
the
was
way
all
it's,
done on
and that's the way it's been always. So if you postmarked it before election day and it received after 5 p.m. on the day after election, it was cast out and did not count.
Well,
None of that changes.
It hasn't always been that way. Let's talk about the current deadline that you just referenced being always that way. In 2017, the legislature unanimously passed House Bill 1151 by our friend Representative Schofield. I don't see him right now. And Senator Paul Betancourt, which prescribed that ballots by mail received by 5 p.m. the day after Election Day should be counted. You voted for that legislation, did you not?
I'm not advised.
It was unanimous. The answer is yes, sir. You voted for that legislation. Every member in this chamber voted for that legislation, and Governor Abbott signed that legislation. This was Schofield and Betancourt's bill. And in that bill, the stated purpose, the aim of that law, according to the bill analysis, was to ensure that a greater number of voters are able to cast a vote that is counted. Was that not the purpose at the time?
Well, Schofield supports the law as it is now. My bill as it is.
I'm just trying to get to the point here. At the time, you voted to make sure that a vote, let's talk about what ballot by mail deadlines are. It has to be filled out properly. It has to be postmarked by 7 p.m. on election day, and then it could be received by 5 p.m. the next day. You voted for that bill. It was a great vote at the time. I was not in the legislature yet, although I would have joined you in voting for that bill. And what is happening today, you are getting rid of that new deadline that you supported and saying you want the deadline at 7 p.m. So members, let's make sure we understand. If we pass this bill, then we are saying a vote that is legally cast, a Texas citizen that fills out a ballot by mail, likely a senior or someone with a disability, and then that vote arrives after 7 p.m. on election day because the post office had a delay, we're going to throw that Texas citizen's vote out.
Yeah, that's the same as it's always been. If that citizen's vote didn't get by at 5 p.m. on Wednesday after that bill that you said everybody voted for, that vote would be cast out. So it's the same. The citizen's responsibility to make sure and get his ballot in on time is the same as it's always been. Mr. Busey, people have to have responsibility to get their vote cast in a way to make sure it gets it done.
Sure, I agree with you.
The state has provided a very easy and a way of doing that through a ballot by mail process, and they're just going to have to follow that process and get it done. And I don't think that's going to stop anybody from voting.
I agree with you that we have to have that responsibility.
Yeah.
I would add
So
that
you're
I
gonna
also
support the
agreed
bill
with you
then?
in 2017 when you said we needed a grace period for that responsibility. And that's what you voted for because there are delays in the post office. Again, I'll remind you, it said to ensure that a greater number of voters are able to cast a vote that is counted. That was a good policy. It maybe should be longer because we allow for overseas and other ballots still to come in by 6 days, but it was a good step intentionally done by Senator Betancourt, Representative Schofield, and yourself and the rest of this body unanimously to say, we understand there could be delays in the mail that has nothing to do with the legit Texan casting a vote. Now, let's move on to executive orders. You stated that you want to get in line with President Trump's executive order to have no ballot by mail received after the deadline of Election Day. Is that correct?
Yeah, as long as, and so is all other 50 states.
Well, let me ask you this. On September 10th, 2024, Governor Abbott said in response to a Biden administration executive order that Texas will not comply. I've searched your social media. I didn't see any opposition to that executive order. I don't want to speak for you. Did you oppose an executive order at that time?
I don't know what executive order you're referring to, but that doesn't mean that we have to accept that one, but this is one that we're going to accept and make it work.
On May 8th, 2024, Governor Abbott said in response to a Biden administration rulemaking on Title IX that Texas will not comply yet again. I want to make sure I didn't miss your opposition to that executive order.
I think if you have questions with Governor Abbott, I think maybe you should go down the hall and ask him yourself, because that's not before us in this body. What's before us in this body is this bill.
Gentlemen, the chair will admonish you to not talk over one another.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, I agree, but your purpose for this bill that is before this body, you stated in your layout, is because an executive order was handed down by the President of the United States, which is why I'm asking about our consistency with this body.
Well, that doesn't really matter. All we're concerned about was what is this, before the body is this bill. And what's before the body is this bill is trying to take this, you told the goal of the legislation is to make sure and increase confidence, in our mail-in ballot process, and I think this executive order, as long as we follow it, will help increase confidence in the mail-in ballot across this nation.
Representative, your intent in needing this change, which is contradicting yourself from 2017, is because of an executive order.
Wasn't my bill.
But time and time again, you have not stood up when this state has told executive orders that we will not comply. But today, your stated purpose for this bill is to comply with an executive order. I want the body to understand why we have an inconsistency.
If it's important to you, did you want to comply with the executive orders that you mentioned before?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, then you should comply with
let me
this
ask
one
you
using
this
your own
question,
logic.
Representative.
Are you
Just last week,
Mr. Busey, are you saying that due to your consistency there, you're going to apply with this one?
with the executive
So I'll
order?
take that as a yes.
If the
Yes.
executive
If
order
you're
comes
saying
into
that
law.
you
Let me
agree
ask
with
you a
them,
question,
then-
Representative.
All right, let's do it. Then I'm glad to see you support this
All right,
bill.
So I didn't want to speak for you. You did
I'm-
oppose the governor the other times. You opposed Ken Paxton the other times.
I'm not opposing anybody. All I want to
Okay,
do is
so
talk
now
about this
today,
bill.
we're gonna
You're bringing
comply.
up some silly comment, and I'm talking about this bill. Let's get this bill done before us. If you have a question
The
directly dealing
comment,
with what
I was
we're
quoting
doing,
Governor
we'll do
Abbott.
that.
I didn't think it was silly. I was just talking about how it was bold and saying we're not going to inherently comply with an executive order. I mean, if you think the governor's comments were silly,
You
but
can, like I
that's not
told
what I
you,
was
you can go
saying.
ask the governor you want. He's down the hall.
Just last week, on May 9th, this chamber passed HJR 98, a joint resolution to call for a convention of states to limit the power of the federal government. Did you vote for that?
Yeah, what does that have to do
Mr.
with this
Busey,
bill?
please confine your questions to the bill that's before the House.
Of course, Mr. Speaker. I apologize. Mr. Speaker, I raise a point of order against further consideration of House Bill 1091 under Rule 4, Section 32C2 of the House Rules on the grounds that the bill analysis is substantially and materially misleading.
Mr. Busey, please bring your point of order down front.